When I was a child, I spent most of my summers in a quiet little town where my grandparents lived. It wasn't even on most maps, just a cluster of old wooden houses, dusty roads, and a single convenience store run by a man who never smiled. But to me, it was magic. The air smelled like sun drenched grass, and the afternoons rang with the hum of cicadas and the creak of tire swings swaying in empty backyards. There was this one place I always returned to, the abandoned daycare at the end of the lane behind my grandparents' house. It had been shut down long before I was born. The story was that a fire broke out in one of the back rooms, and though no one was hurt, the town chose to close it permanently. It stood there like a forgotten memory, peeling paint, shattered windows, and a faded sign that once read, Little Lantern's Learning Center. To everyone else, it was just a shell of something that used to be. But to me, it was something else entirely. I can't explain it, but even as a child, I felt drawn to it, like it remembered me, even though I had never stepped inside. I'd ride my rusted bike up to the edge of the broken fence and just watch. I imagined children laughing inside, tiny hands painting suns and flowers, napping on colorful mats beneath paper lanterns that still hung limp in the windows. One summer evening, when the air was especially still and the sky a deep, soft orange, I heard music coming from inside. A faint lullaby played on an out-of-tune piano. I stood frozen, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The daycare was locked up, boarded in some parts, but I was sure, so sure, I heard it. The next day I told my grandfather, and he just chuckled, said I had a big imagination and maybe I heard someone's radio from the neighborhood. But our closest neighbor was nearly half a mile away. Still, I nodded and let it go. I started going there more often. Sometimes I'd bring my sketchbook and sit near the fence, drawing what I imagined the inside looked like. Bright walls with handprints, toy shelves, maybe a reading corner with beanbags. I even drew little kids playing, though I never gave them faces. Something about that felt wrong. Then one day I saw her, a little girl in a pale blue dress standing at the window. Her hair was long, dark, and messy, and her hands were pressed against the glass. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and she was gone. No sound, no movement, nothing. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't scared, not really. More curious, maybe even excited. I started coming every day, hoping to see her again. Sometimes I'd bring a toy and leave it near the gate. A doll, a small car, a puzzle piece. The next day, it would be gone, always. But I never saw who took them. My dreams changed too. I started having these vivid, strange dreams about rooms I'd never seen. Rooms filled with sunlight, tiny chairs, laughter echoing like it was coming from underwater. And always that same lullaby, playing in the background, warbled and slow, like the tape was melting. As the summer days grew shorter, I felt like the daycare was pulling me closer, like it was waiting. I couldn't understand why, but I was sure of it. Something about that place wasn't finished, and part of me, a part I didn't want to admit, felt like I belonged there. Looking back now, I don't know what was real and what wasn't. Maybe it really was my imagination, like my grandfather said. Or maybe that forgotten daycare remembered me better than I remembered myself. 15 years later, I found myself standing at the edge of that same broken fence. I hadn't planned to return. Life had taken me far from that town. New cities, new people, the usual noise of growing up. My grandparents were gone, their old house now empty, and I'd come back to sign a few papers and hand the keys to a realtor. That was supposed to be it. In and out. No ghosts. No memories. But the moment I stepped into that dusty street and smelled that dry summer air, something shifted, like a long-forgotten breath catching in my throat. I don't even remember walking here. One moment I was standing in the overgrown front yard of my grandparents' house, and the next I was back at the fence, staring at the hollowed remains of little lanterns. It hadn't changed much, just older, sadder. The paint had all but peeled away, and ivy now choked the walls. The sign had fallen completely, lying in the weeds like a lost gravestone. I should have turned around, but instead, I pushed the creaking gate open and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been. Dust floated in sunbeams like ash. I walked up to the front doors, surprised to see the boards were missing. Just gone. Someone had removed them recently. I hesitated only a second before stepping through. The inside was darker than I remembered, though I'd never truly seen it before. It smelled of mold and rust and something sweeter, familiar, but wrong. My footsteps echoed on the warped wooden floor. The hallway was lined with faded murals, children with balloons, smiling suns, trees with twisted trunks. Their paint was smeared, almost melted, like they'd been crying for years. I turned a corner and found a door slightly ajar. A storage room, I assumed. I pushed it open. Inside were tiny chairs stacked in the corner, a shelf of decaying books, and a small upright piano, keys yellowed and chipped. I stared at it, heart pounding. Without thinking, I pressed one key, a dull, lifeless note. And then I heard it. A laugh, not outside, not in the hallway, right behind me. I spun around, nothing. But the room had changed. The dust in the air was gone, and the smell had shifted. Now it smelled like crayons and cookies, and that sticky sweet scent of fruit juice left out too long. I backed out quickly, heart hammering. But the hallway wasn't the same anymore. The light had changed, no longer the pale gray light of afternoon, but warmer, like early morning. I heard faint footsteps, small, quick. I told myself to leave, that it was just my mind playing tricks. But something deeper inside, something buried, whispered, "You've been here before." And then I saw her again, at the far end of the hallway. The same little girl, same pale blue dress, same tangled hair. She stood perfectly still, staring at me. But this time, she had a face, and it was mine. Not mine now, mine as a child, 6 years old. Blank expression, pale eyes, mouth twitching like she was about to cry, or scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. She raised one hand and pointed to a door at her side. Slowly, the door creaked open. I blinked, and she was gone. The hallway was empty again, silent. But the door she had opened now glowed faintly, as if lit from the inside. I stepped closer. On the door, scratched faintly into the wood, was a name. Lena. My middle name. A name only my grandmother ever used. The door swung wider, revealing a small square room filled with dust-covered toys and tiny beds. At the far end of the room, on one of the walls, was a drawing, faded, crayon-colored, but still visible. It was of a girl in a blue dress standing outside the daycare. She was holding hands with someone, a taller figure drawn in all black. The figure had no face. Underneath it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Don't forget again." That's when I felt it. Not fear, not exactly, but a deep, aching wrongness. Like something sacred had been broken inside me a long time ago. And this place remembered it, even if I didn't. I stumbled out of the room and down the hall, barely registering the shadows that seemed to grow longer with every step. The air was colder now. The laughter had stopped. But I knew, somehow, that I had just opened a door that couldn't be closed. I don't remember leaving the daycare. One moment I was in that toy room, staring at the crayon drawing. The next, I was outside, standing under a darkening sky. The air, thick like rain, was about to fall. My hands were trembling. My mouth was dry. But the worst part, the part that still makes my skin crawl, was the mud on my shoes. Thick, fresh, like I'd been walking through the backyard. Though I knew I hadn't. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed in my grandparents' house. Just one last night, I told myself. But everything felt off. The clock on the wall kept stopping at 3:12 a.m., even after I replaced the batteries. The hallway light flickered once every few minutes, and the house creaked constantly, as if something or someone was pacing slowly through the attic. I told myself it was just age, just nerves. But when I lay down and closed my eyes, the dreams returned. Except they weren't dreams anymore. They were memories. I saw myself as a child, standing outside the daycare. I wasn't alone. There were others, other children. Familiar faces but blurred. Laughing, singing, pulling each other toward the gate. And I saw myself hesitate, staring at the building with unease. I didn't want to go in. I remember that now. I remember the fear. But something pulled me forward. In the dream, I entered a room with a red carpet and tiny chairs. And then, darkness, cold, heavy darkness, no sound, no breath. Just an overwhelming sense of being watched. Then the voice came. Low, female, gentle, but wrong, like a mother's lullaby played backward. It whispered my name. Not the name I use now, not my first name. Lena. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My phone was dead, though I'd charged it the night before. The lights wouldn't turn on. And then I heard it. That lullaby, software, twisted, echoing faintly from down the hall. I got up and followed it. Not because I wanted to, but because my body moved before my mind could stop it. The music led me to the basement door. A place I hadn't dared enter since I was 8. The handle was warm. The door creaked open slowly, revealing darkness thicker than it should have been. I stepped down the stairs, one at a time. Each creak felt like a warning. At the bottom, I saw it, a small chair, a child's chair, facing the wall, and seated in it was the girl, or me, or something pretending to be me. She turned her head slowly. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, her mouth too wide. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as she stood up and pointed to the far wall. On it, written in a child's handwriting, were the words, "You left us." Suddenly, the room filled with whispers, children's voices, dozens of them, crying, laughing, screaming, pleading. The air turned icy. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from around me. They were coming from inside me. And then I remembered. I had been in that daycare. Not as a visitor, not as a stranger, as a student. I had gone there one summer when my parents had to travel overseas. Just a few weeks. I was barely 5. But something had happened. Something awful. The fire. But there hadn't been a fire. That was a lie. A cover-up. There had been a man. A volunteer, they said. He worked with staff. No one suspected anything. Until the day 3 children went missing. The building was shut down overnight. Authorities claimed it was a gas leak. But I remembered now. I remembered the screams, the red room, the door that locked from the outside. I had been there. I had seen it, and I had run. I had escaped, and I never told a soul. Somewhere inside, the guilt had buried itself. I forgot to survive. My mind had sealed the trauma behind locked doors. But that place remembered. They remembered. The whispers grew louder, angrier. The girl in the chair began to cry. Soft, choking sobs. And then she looked up at me with those hollow eyes and whispered, "We waited for you." The room shattered. I stumbled backward, hit the stairs, and scrambled up like something was chasing me. When I burst into the hallway, the house was silent again. Normal, but I knew nothing was normal. I left the town the next morning. Never looked back. Never told anyone. I sold the house. Blocked the realtor's number. Changed mine. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm half asleep and the world is quiet, I still hear the lullaby. And I see her, waiting by the window, wearing a pale blue dress, smiling with my face.